Sup? What's up everyone, it's Goose, and today I almost ate some expired food. Today we're going to be seeing if the Friedman model on the $600 to $700 HX Stomp compares with the Neural Quad Cortex and the Fractal FM9. Last time we had compared the Quad Cortex and the FM9 Friedman HBE models with the C45 switch. And I had admittedly forgotten that the HX Stomp XL, the Friedman model on here, actually does have the HBE switch on it as well. So I decided to make a second video, which is what you're seeing today, comparing the three. I'm basically repeating myself here at this point, but Friedman's HBE model is an additional gain stage added onto the already saturated BE model. And for a lot of folks, that adds a little bit of a stuffiness to the mids, it compresses it a little bit so it doesn't sound quite as open as the BE channel. And so that's where that C45 switch comes in. It scoops the mids slightly, but makes it a little bit more open sounding. And so that combination of switches on the Friedman amps is actually something that I feel like is pretty special. So we're comparing all the modelers with those settings on today. Before I move on, if you like nerding out about guitar gear like I do, please consider hitting like and subscribe. All right, so for the setup today, we're going to be using my FGN with the Seymour Duncan Pegasus in the bridge. All the modelers will be running the same drive, same amp, and the same IR. No gates will be used, and the global EQs for all of them will be flat. The Fractal FM9 actually has the thump or depth knob modeled, and the other two units don't, so we're going to leave that a default for the FM9. But all the other settings will be the same. You'll see them on screen here, and hopefully I remember to add the settings in post. Also, the Quad Cortex has a voice switch, which I turned on, and I think that sounds closer to the other two units. The drive block will be the Boss SD1. It'll be engaged for the high gain tones, and then not engaged for the mid gain tones. The IR we're using is the same one as last time. It'll be Mix 3 from the York Audio Bogner 4x12 pack. So we're going to do some mid-gain tones, and then we're going to do some high-gain tones. We'll start with the mid-gain tones. As always, we're going to start with some kind of simple open strings, single string strumming, and then some chords. Get into the actual riffs, and then at the end, we'll do a volume test so you can see how the models react to rolling down the volume knob on your guitar. With that out of the way, let's go. All right, so the biggest difference here that I found was kind of the difference in the weight of the single notes. I think both neural and fractal sound close, and the HX Stomp is just a little bit more kind of mid or upper mid focused. The fractal is a bit clearer than the other two, a little bit more hi-fi sounding, whereas the neural is a little bit more warmer, a little bit more low mid emphasis, and in some bits there is a little bit of edge on the highs. I think that helps the neural sound a little bit smoother than the other two, but also clearer than the HX Stomp XL. However, I do think fractal sounds bigger. Fractal has that kind of wall of sound to it. And that's not necessarily better, it just depends on what you're looking for. That wall of sound is a preference. Some people might like it more, some people might like kind of the more MIDI, sort of almost more vintage sounding tones of the HX Stomp. I do think for lead tones though, I think the HX Stomp sounds the most kind of natural. It's got a bit more snarl because of that upper mid-range emphasis, and because of that, it ends up sounding a little bit more vintage, but I guess vintage tones are more natural for some folks. However, for the volume test, I don't think the HX Stomp holds up quite as well as the other two. Modelers generally don't do that as well as like a tube amp, but I do think that the neural and the fractal do a little bit of a better job than the Line 6. But I think there are elements of each for mid-gain that I'd like. And I think if you prefer one or the other, or the other, I don't think there's really a wrong answer here. It's just basically preference. All right, let's move on to high gain tones. This is with the Boss SD1 enabled with these settings right here. And after the riffs, for the first time, we're going to do a noise test as well. As I mentioned, the HBE is adding an additional gain stage onto the already saturated BE channel. And so that's going to introduce a little bit more noise than I'm used to. And so I think it'd be a great thing to compare how much noise these modelers do have. But yeah, let's go. All right, so with the boost added, I actually think these tones got a little bit closer. However, the characteristics are still there. Basically, the neural is a little bit warmer, the fractal is a little bit more kind of bright or clearer, and the HX Stomp is a little bit more mid-emphasis. I think the HX Stomp and the fractal are equally as tight, with neural being a little flubbier than the other two. However, both neural and fractal have kind of more of a 3D feeling to the saturation, the distortion character, whereas I think the HX Stomp is a little bit more kind of direct. And I think that has to do with the fact that the HX Stomp actually has slightly less gain than the other two. Oddly, I do actually kind of prefer pinches on the neural quad cortex ever so slightly, but some riffs on it could also be a little bit too bassy. I mean, it has a Boss SD1 in front of it. It should be tighter than it is in my opinion. But yeah, sometimes they just can come off a little bit bassy. And oddly enough, on that last riff, there's a little bit more of a cocked wah feeling on the HX Stomp XL. Again, that's kind of a thing that I think people who like more vintage tones will like, because that's kind of a characteristic of guitar tones from like the 80s. And so if you like that kind of tone, I think the HX Stomp does that the best. And once again, I think the fractal is kind of the most hi-fi sounding. I think for some people that feels a little bit unnatural, but I do also think that it does add a lot of clarity to the sound, and it does sound really good in my opinion. In regards to the noise test, HX Stomp does have slightly less gain than the other two, but has significantly less noise than the Quad Cortex. The fractal is kind of somewhere in between. I think it's closer to the HX Stomp, but to my ears, it has a little bit more noise than the HX Stomp. But the neural actually has kind of surprised me with how much noise it had. However, with all three of these units, I think adding a gate will just clear all the noise up anyways, and you're going to be using a gate. You're definitely going to be using a gate with this much gain. I just thought it was interesting to compare the noise of all of these units with the same amp models. And so if you found this interesting or if you found it helpful, let me know in the comments. So which of these models do I prefer? Weirdly enough, I actually feel like I'd like to Frankenstein a little bit of each of these models. I've noticed that with a lot of these comparisons that we've done with the Neural Quad Cortex, the amp models just tend to be slightly bassier than the other units. And to some people, I think that's just more pleasing and smoother to their ears. And there are definitely comments where people actually prefer that over the other units. I actually wasn't expecting kind of the mid focus of the HX Stomp, but again, that actually probably plays better to more vintage tone. One of the best tones I've ever heard live is actually from a Helix rack. And so maybe that mid push will actually cut through a mix a little bit better and actually sound better in kind of the context of a band than the other two units. And the fractal is a little bit more hi-fi sounding. I love how clear it is in the high end. Like the saturation is just absolutely like detailed, and it's weird to describe distortion as detailed, but that's basically how I feel about the FM9. I do think some people find that clarity to be a little bit unnatural, but I find it to be awesome because it's just kind of like an exemplary example of a really good amp model. And Neural kind of has that too, in my opinion. It has a little bit of that clarity up top, even though it is a little bit warmer. I think the Neural and the fractal are actually a lot closer than people would like you to believe. And so in conclusion, does this $600 to $700 unit compare to the $1,700 units? Absolutely. Honestly, it's within the ballpark. If you tweak the global EQ on this, you could probably get it to sound almost exactly like the other two. They're within a margin of each other, in my opinion. And if you don't need the extra processing power of the Quad Cortex or the FM9, this gets you basically to the same level of tone as the other two units. If you don't mind a bigger unit, the full-fledged Helix or the Helix LT will have the same tones as this thing, but have kind of more processing power, more akin to what you get on the FM9 or the Quad Cortex. And so yeah, which model do you prefer? Let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, that's gonna do it for me. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Later.